Before we start carving the remaining parts of the katana, which are essentially the parts that make up the handle, I wanted to go over with you guys how some of those parts interrelate. They rely on each other a lot more than the parts that we've been creating already, and even though they're not really difficult, you do need some of the dimensions from like the Ito to carve the Fuchi and Kashira. You need to know how long the Ito is going to be, how long your ska is going to be. So just to kind of show you and illustrate how some of those parts rely on each other, I wanted to do an overview instead of trying to do it in each separate video. So to start off with, I wanted to give you a rundown of all the different parts we're going to be needing. We're going to carve a Fuchi, or a collar, the ska, which is actually the wood handle, Kashira, or end cap, Ito, which is what we're going to be using to wrap the handle with, Mekoi pins, which is how we fasten the handle, or the ska, to the tang, Same, which is typically ray skin, which is used to cover the wood handle before it's wrapped, and Hishigami, which are paper inserts which you actually keep underneath the wrapping to help keep its shape, the diamond wrap shape. We're not actually going to be using Same or Hishigami in the tutorial. However, at the appropriate video, I will show different resources that you can use in order to incorporate that into your project. Some of the dimensions that we've got going on that we'll be using for the tutorial is that from the top of the Fuchi to the bottom of Kashira is going to be 9 3/4 inch. However, the actual ska, or wood handle that we'll be carving, is only going to be 9 1/4 inch. You can see it's actually going to be recessed into these two parts. And the actual distance we're going to be wrapping is only 8 3/4 inch. Again, because of that recess. In terms of the shape of our ska, there's a couple different possible ones. The one that we'll be using is shown here as kind of a curved, tapered shape. I actually find this one easy to construct and also find it the most attractive, so that's kind of the reason why we'll be using that one. But you can see we've also got an hourglass shape, a straight taper, and a curve without a taper. These are of course exaggerated drawings, but you kind of get the idea of how the shape might differ. Now to kind of come to some of the dimensions that I've been using and how I might get to them, especially with the Ito, you're going to need to know three things about your Ito. The first is the height of it, which is going to determine the wrappable distance of your ska, the width of your Ito, which you're going to need for your Fuchi and Kashira, and your Ito length, how much are you going to need of it. Basically, the height and the width are determined just by taking a piece of Ito, whatever you're going to be using, and stretching it out and then taking the measurements. It has to be stretched because that's how it's going to be on the ska itself. So if you don't take it stretched and you find out, and you stretch it over the ska as we're wrapping it, the measurement's going to be off. So make sure you take your measurements stretched because that's the way it's going to be on your ska. Now to determine how much Ito you're going to need, you need to know a couple things. You need to know the ska length, basically how much you're going to be wrapping, and then you're also going to need to know the overall handle length. The first, the ska length, is essentially the length of that is going to be the 1/2 inch of material that is going to be recessed into the Fuchi and Kashira, plus the wrappable distance. Now the wrappable distance is relying on two variables. The first variable is that X has to be an odd number. That's just a caveat. It's dependent on the way we wrap the handle. So that is kind of a given. Just have to make sure that this overall length covers the tang, and that X in this case must be odd. So in this case it's going to be 37. The height of your Ito is going to be put in for H, and in this case I'm using 1/4 inch. I use a bias tape instead of like an actual silk or cotton Ito, and it works quite well for me. But the stretched height is 1/4 inch, and so that's what I'm using for these equations. So the wrappable distance is going to be 37 times 1/4. So as you can see further on in the equation, the length for me is going to be 1/2 inch plus 37 times 1/4 inch equals 9 1/4 inch. You can see all I did was I just simplified the equation here. So my actual ska that I'll be carving is 9 1/4 inch long. So how do I take that and find out how much Ito I need? Well, basically you take the overall length of the handle and add 2 to it, and that'll give you the length in feet. So the ska length plus 1/2, that is the ska length plus the 1/2 inch that you've had recessed into the Fuchi and Kashira, plus the 1/2 inch that's added on for the Fuchi and Kashira that's not recessed, plus 2. So the ska length is 9 1/4, as we found up here, and then that 1/2 inch is just added in, and you add 2 to it. And this gives you, like I said, the amount of Ito you need in feet, which is 11 3/4. Now I've just rounded that up to be between 12 and 13 feet. That kind of gives you a little bit of extra, and also gives you, make sure you have enough, and you don't find out that you're short after you've wrapped your handle and you're short by an inch, and you're like, now where am I going to be? So just make sure for this, if you're using 1/4 inch Ito, as I am, you need about 12 to 13. Now you should be able to use 12 to 13 feet of Ito for whatever actual height of Ito you're using, because this equation is based roughly on any range between 3/16 to 5/16. So you should be able to buy 12 to 13 feet of whatever Ito you're going to be using for the project, as long as your handle isn't going to be much bigger than this 9 1/4. So now, if you are using a different than 1/4 inch Ito, you just sub it in for this equation. So instead of Ito height of being 1/4 for H, you use 3/16 or 5/16, plug that in. Just make sure that this 37 doesn't have to be 37, but it does have to be odd. So X has to be odd, and as long as this right here, X times H, as long as that covers your tang, as long as that's long enough to cover your tang, you're all set. And then you just plug that in, like I said, instead of 1/4 inch here, you'd plug in 3/16 or 5/16, somewhere in that range, and keep just following these equations here. And again, like I said, you should be able to buy between 12 and 13 feet of Ito to cover it. If you're nervous, go for 13 or 14, and that should cover you. So that basically covers it. And like I said, you need to know your height, your width, and your length of the Ito. And then you should be all set to cover the next pieces. Now, like I said, these do interrelate a little bit. I hope this explained how that does, how they align with each other and how the pieces are going to go together. I'll explain a little bit more detail per video when I get to the appropriate video, but I hope that kind of helps out and gives you a good sense of what you're going to be needing. So the next part is we're going to be starting with the Fuchi, and I'll see you on the video.